Access to Democracy is made possible thanks to the following organizations. Recalibra Health, a new nationwide telehealth platform designed to provide safe and effective health and wellness products at affordable prices. Available products include compound GLP-1 for weight loss, as well as multiple medications for men's and women's health and hair loss, all administered under the direct supervision of expert physicians, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants. Visit recalibrahealth.com for more information. Sheridan and Dulas, PA, a family and criminal defense law firm, has been serving clients in Dakota County and throughout Minnesota for over 40 years. Ranked a Tier 1 Best Law Firm by U.S. News & World Report every year since 2009. Sheridan and Dulas are here to help you in your most difficult life circumstances. Learn more at ssdpa.com. Established in 2007 and based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, 45th Parallel Distillery was among the first 50 micro distilleries in the United States. All aspects of production occur at their facility. If you're interested in learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check their website and plan a visit to tour their facility and taste their spirits. 45thParallelDistillery.com. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has been proudly serving its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. It's a pleasure to welcome back to our studio a return guest. Lori Sturdevant was a journalist for many years with the Star Tribune and covering politics in the Minnesota Legislature, and also is the author of numerous books about important figures in Minnesota history. Her latest book, which came out in late 2025, is about the late Speaker of the Minnesota House and Minnesota Congressman Martin Olav Sabo. Lori, welcome back to Access to Democracy.
Well, thank you, Steve. Fun to be with you and fun to talk about Martin Sabo.
Yes, indeed. He was a remarkable person. I had the great privilege of knowing him when I was a young congressional staffer in Washington in the early 80s, working for Bruce Vento. And being from the other side of the river on the St. Paul side, Martin from the Minneapolis side. And I should tell you right at the outset, we had a softball team called the Minnesota Knee-Jerk Liberals, which was made up of the staffs of Martin Sabo, Bruce Vento, and Jim Oberstar.
Oh, and I bet Martin loved that because
Martin
he
was
loved
our coach.
Loved baseball and softball, and yes, he was the coach of the Democratic Caucus Squad.
That's right.
In the annual fundraiser that baseball, not softball, that the congressional teams put on every year. Yes.
So I think it's fair to say, I'm sure you'd agree with me, few people in modern Minnesota politics have had more of an impact on the state of Minnesota and even on national politics than our own Martin Sabo. Tell us just briefly, where did Martin Sabo come from, and how do you think he embarked on this remarkable career in politics and public service?
Well, Martin Sabo was the son of a pair of Norwegian immigrants, was the second child, the only son of immigrants who lived in Alcabo, North Dakota, which is as far from the Twin Cities as you can get and still be in North Dakota. They're way up in that far northwestern corner. Raised in a very small town setting, a small town that had a strong Scandinavian stamp, cared very much about education, cared about the kind of liberal agrarian politics that produced the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota and the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota, and was much involved with the Lutheran Free Church, which had as its college campus Augsburg College in Minneapolis.
Which Martin Sabo attended, comes to Minneapolis as a young man from the North Dakota Prairie.
Comes at age 17, graduates in 1959 at age 21, and 1 year later, 1960 election, he's elected to the Minnesota House.
At the ripe age of 22?
22 years old,
that's
right.
Really remarkable.
It was not the youngest, but close to it, one of the several 20-somethings that were a part of the legislature at a time when the legislature was a pretty old, gray-haired, hidebound institution.
Right.
And that was an institution that was ripe for reform, and Martin Sabo was a reformer.
And your book does such a good job of describing what the Minnesota legislature used to be like. Very different from today. The contrast could not be more striking. It was pretty much, it was an all-white male institution for the most part, wasn't it? There were no women serving in the legislature, no people of color?
No people of color, very few women, and certainly very few, and those few women that were there had very little visibility or leadership responsibility. The legislature met every other year, had met for only 3 months of the year, and was run as a set of little fiefdoms with committee chairs having great power, other legislators not so much. But Martin Sabo approached service in the legislature as if it were a graduate seminar, a graduate school, and he was a student visiting all these committees, learning about them, taking the time to really develop relationships, and became quite a student of the institution. So when it was time to change the institution, he knew what to do.
And Martin Sabo was always, throughout his career, a very serious student of public policy, that he really immersed himself in subjects which he became quite an expert on. For example, you describe in the book how he undertook to understand Minnesota's tax system and state spending. This became really important to his later legislative success at the legislature, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He understood that knowledge was really power. What knowledge gave you the opportunity to be of service, and he considered that part of the stewardship. There's a good old Lutheran and Methodist word for us. He approached his service with a sense of stewardship for the government, for the institution, which he wanted to be robust and strong and effective enough to be a good steward of the public purse, but also to serve the needs of the people as he believed they should be served. So that was why he cared, for example, about balanced budgets, so that the government would be a reliable partner, helping people with the housing, the education, the health care that he believed government should provide.
You mentioned that the Minnesota legislature in those days was really considered a part-time job, and the legislative calendar was limited, the number of legislative days that they could actually meet and pass legislation. And the legislature was dominated by people from rural areas of greater Minnesota at that time, wasn't it?
Well,
even though most of the population, as today, was centered in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and suburban areas?
Well, this is why redistricting is important, because this state had not done a legislative redistricting, at least not a comprehensive one, between 1913 and 1966, when a federal judge named Harry Blackmun, a judge from Minnesota that people will know from another issue entirely, Harry Blackmun was on the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, and he had the case involving Minnesota's legislative maps. And he said in 1965, "Thou shalt redistrict or I will." And so the legislature finally got serious and allowed for the metropolitan area, which had grown so much in that 50-year span, to finally get the representation it deserved. Going forward, that made the legislature much more representative of the state and much more effective.
Because there was a tremendous disparity in the number of people that legislators were representing, which
Absolutely.
effectively diluted the votes of people representing urban, suburban constituencies.
That's right. Well, by the early 1960s, there were some metro area state senate districts that had 100,000 people, while some rural districts had fewer than 10,000. So it was quite
a 10-to-1 disparity.
Just an amazingly out of balance situation, and the courts had been sort of nibbling at that, but it was not until Harry Blackmun wrote the order, I believe in 1965, "Get busy, Minnesota, or I'll do it for you."
And at some point in the mid-1960s, if I remember this correctly, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a famous decision, Baker versus Carr, one man, one vote, it came to be known as, said basically that legislative districts, this applied to all legislative districts for legislature, Congress, et cetera, had to be roughly equal in population. You couldn't have these big disparities.
Well, that's right. That was a 1962 decision, and it was the first of several decisions that the Supreme Court made in that period. And of course, it was that sequence of legal actions that led to Harry Blackmun's order for Minnesota and the 1966 redistricting. So finally, come the 1967 session, the legislature has a reasonable representation of the metro area. This is just as young Martin Sabo is beginning to become more visible. 2 years later, 1969, he becomes DFL minority leader.
Wow. And we should understand the composition of the legislature at the time we're talking about, the early 1960s, We don't have at that time party identification. Legislators were not identified as Democrat or Republican. What were they?
Liberal and conservative. That's right. It was officially a nonpartisan legislature. There are so many ways in which that legislative body in the pre-1970s period were quite different from the body that we now think of. And that's one of them. They did not run with party labels.
And later, Martin Sabo was part of the effort to change that, pass legislation requiring candidates to run as Democrat or Republican or independent.
Well, that was a big part, but there were several other elements too of a big reform agenda that finally gets ahead of steam and can finally pass beginning in the 1973 session, which is when Martin Sabo becomes Speaker and the DFL takes control of the governorship, the Senate, and the House for the first time.
For the first time in the state's history. And since the merger of the Farmer Labor Party that had been separate merged with the Democratic Party under the leadership of Hubert Humphrey.
Well, that's absolutely right. And of course, that happens in 1944. The Farmer Labor Party enjoyed considerable success in the 1930s, but all during that period, the conservatives, Republicans, held the Minnesota Senate. It was not until the 1973 session that the Senate switches to DFL control, and then what we call now a trifecta was finally available.
Unified control, DFL control, the governorship, both houses of the legislature. Tell us about, people may have heard this term before, but may not really understand its importance in Minnesota's political history. The Minnesota Miracle. What is the Minnesota Miracle, and why is it so important to how education was funded in the state of Minnesota?
Well, that was the big bill that was passed in 1971, and we tend to associate it with that period of DFL takeover, but it was passed by a Republican-controlled legislature and a new DFL governor, Wendell Anderson, in the longest special session in state history, ran until the end of October. And the gist of what was finally passed is a rather major increase in state both income and sales taxes so that more money could flow to school districts and school district property taxes could be reduced. Think about it. This was the time in our state when all those baby boomer kids, which maybe includes you and me, were in school, and the strain on school budgets was incredible. The property tax, anti-property tax feeling in the state was very high, and Wendell Anderson was elected governor on a promise to do something about that. He turned then quickly to his friend Martin Sabo, who was one of the engineers of what passed.
So there were tremendous disparities in the levels of funding for public schools in Minnesota. So if you were a child, say, growing up in Wayzata or Edina, affluent communities, your schools had a lot more money that was raised through property taxes than, say, rural districts or even certain urban districts in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Well, that was certainly, remedying that problem was certainly a goal of the Minnesota Miracle. Now let me acknowledge that we haven't fully gotten there yet. We still have probably an uncomfortable amount of disparity between property-rich districts and property-poor ones. Nevertheless, the first big bite, I think, that the state took to address that problem happened with the 1971 session. And it was, like I say, at the engineering and the pushing of then minority leader Martin Sabo, who was also one of Wendell Anderson's key advisors on what actually passed.
So tell us, Lori, about the Republicans. Who are a couple of the key Republican figures who pushed for tax increases to go toward public education? Who would they have been?
Well, the main one I think you have to credit is Stanley Holmquist, who was the Republican Senate leader and had been a school superintendent in Grove City, Minnesota. And for those people who are interested in Minnesota trivia might also be interested to know that he was the brother-in-law of Governor Elmer L. Anderson, not Wendell, Elmer L. Anderson. So it sounds like this state is sort of one small town or one big family. But Stanley Holmquist, having been a school superintendent in a rural place, understood very well what was wrong with school finances in Minnesota and how a remedy was required from the state. So he, again, made an alliance with Martin Sabo and Wendell Anderson to engineer the Minnesota Miracle.
And by the way, you and I definitely are beneficiaries of the Minnesota Miracle. I was in the Minneapolis public schools throughout the 1960s and 70s until I graduated in 74.
Okay.
Roosevelt High School, who had a famous alum who went on to become governor, James Janos, Jesse Ventura.
I believe we know him well, yes.
That's
well,
right.
I'm from South Dakota. So I watched as some of the best teachers in my high school took jobs in Minnesota because
Interesting.
Because Minnesota, by the late 60s, early 70s, Minnesota was paying those good teachers better than we could pay them in South Dakota.
Tell us more about Martin Sabo's relationship with Republicans. You know, we have a politics today in our time that seems very adversarial and confrontational, but isn't it true Martin Sabo went out of his way to actually develop relationships on the Republican side of the aisle, and that helped him achieve some of his legislative success, didn't it?
That's absolutely true, and he took pride in it, so much so that at the end of his life, when he was doing some interviews, oral history kind of interviews, he would boast about how he prided himself on never personally attacking a Republican opponent. I've interviewed some Republicans for this book, and they attest that that was absolutely the case. It wasn't just a Lutheran Sunday school lesson to not speak ill of your opponents, though I'm sure that may be affected to some extent. He had a sense that the mission he was about was governance, and the state would be better governed if everybody could participate in a fair way. Another thing he was a big pusher for was fair representation of minorities, the minority caucuses on legislative committees. Prior to the reform era that Martin Sabo led, many committees, key committees, were disproportionately controlled by the majority, and the minority members.
So that the minority effectively had no voice.
Oh, yeah, very little voice, very few seats on the main money committees, for example, and on the Rules Committee in the House, no representation at all. And Martin was instrumental in changing that.
Lori, your book, one of the most interesting parts, I thought, was the description of how Martin Sabo was a very fierce advocate for professionalizing the legislature. We're talking about the creation of an Office of Legislative Counsel, the Office of House Research. Say a word about that, how that changed the Minnesota legislature for the good.
Well, absolutely it did. It made the legislature more ambitious. And think about the policy areas that have really grown enormously in the intervening years. I don't think it would have been possible, for example, for the state to become a leader in healthcare policy and healthcare innovation, were it not for House research and some of the participation that Minnesotans had in national conferences around those kinds of complicated policy areas. Similarly with the environment, an area that they were just beginning to get into in the late 1960s. The creation of the Pollution Control Agency was in the late 1960s. That area has become a much more important area for the state. And the whole complexity that we have developed around how tax policy works in the state. There's just a great deal of learning to be done. Martin believed that he saw himself as a career legislator. He wanted to encourage others to see themselves as
he was proud of it.
Professional career legislators. They wanted the expertise of the body to reside in the members, the elected officials, not so much with the lobbyists, certainly to be buttressed by good staff, but to have the expertise reside with the people who had election certificates.
And this professionalization of the legislature, if you will, it became one of these Minnesota ideas that we exported to other states. Martin played a key role in the creation of the National Conference of State Legislators.
That's exactly right, and that's an organization that a lot of your viewers may never have heard of, but those of us who follow legislative stuff know NCSL quite well. It's been quite a powerhouse and a resource.
Based in Washington, D.C., right?
Washington and Denver, because the notion always was that it needed to be sort of out of D.C. as well, and be in a place where people from around the country could easily attend conferences. So Denver is its second home. But I interviewed the longtime executive director of NCSL, William Pound, who had nothing but good to say about the leadership Martin displayed both in the creation of that group, which was created through the merger of several previous organizations, but then raising its relevance and profile so that it became a much better tool for legislators like those from Minnesota.
Right. And the research that came out of, was developed by NCSL, was information that was shared among Democrats and Republicans.
Absolutely.
It wasn't partisan, but it was objective information that legislators could rely upon to help them make decisions on important issues.
Well, the notion was that state governments, state legislatures all around the country needed to improve their act, get their act together. In those years after the redistricting changes that we saw in Minnesota happened in lots of states, lots of places, There was a new energy in lots of legislatures in the 1970s and 80s. And the thought was the federal government shouldn't have all the action. It happened at the same time that the federal government was beginning to adopt revenue sharing and other kinds of policies that did put more authority back in the hands of local and state governments. Being able to exercise that authority well was something that Martin had in mind.
So as we jump ahead to the year 1978, this is a turning point year in Minnesota politics. What happened in 1978?
Well, after 2 years of the Watergate elections, when the Democrats really were cleaned up in terms of legislative elections and statewide elections, by 1978, the political pendulum in this state is swinging the other direction, and swinging in a pretty hard and direct way. And Martin Sabo has an opportunity to run for one of the plum seats in the political arena, a safe urban congressional district, where one can apply one's craft. If one wants to be a lifelong legislator, you can stay there for a long time.
5th Congressional District,
do a lot
Minneapolis,
of good.
and Hennepin County.
It became open because Hubert Humphrey had died, and Don Fraser, the longtime member of Congress, opted to run for Humphrey's U.S. Senate seat. That cleared the way for a new candidate to run for the 5th Congressional District, and here comes Martin Sabo. Now, he did this without any visible hesitation. But later in life, he talks about what was his favorite job, and it was being Speaker of the Minnesota House. He did leave that position with some reluctance, and I found a photo in the Star Tribune, I wish we'd used it in the book, of him wiping a tear as he was in up on the rostrum there one last time in March of 1978.
We should mention that year 1978 sees the election of David Durenberger to the U.S. Senate, Rudy Boschwitz, and Al Quie defeats Rudy Perpich, who had succeeded Wendell Anderson as governor after Anderson had arranged his own appointment.
That's right.
To the Senate seat. So really a earthquake year in Minnesota politics.
The Republicans still call it the Minnesota Massacre. And there was a photo that I have used in book talks about this book from the next day's Minneapolis Tribune. The Star Tribune hadn't merged yet. But the Tribune had this yearbook-like lineup of mugshots at the top of the page of all the winners the night before. And there's this row of Republicans: Al Quie, Dave Durenberger, Rudy Boschwitz, Bill Frenzel, and one Democrat, Martin Sabo.
Who won the congressional seat.
Seat handily, yes.
So Martin Sabo moves his family to Washington, D.C. He assumes his seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. What does he do when he gets to Washington? What is the key committee that he gets onto?
He's fortunate enough to get onto the Appropriations Committee and be part of that budget-making part of the Congress. That's where he wanted to be, and through a series of happenstances that we describe in the book, that happens for him. And it puts him on a track that leads, in 1993, so now we're 15 years later, leads to him being the chair of the House Budget Committee, one of the really powerful positions. At a time when Bill Clinton is president, the Democrats are clearly in the majority, so he has that gavel, and they have a chance to do some things. I may be getting ahead of the story here, but that becomes a significant budget achievement, the only balanced budget enacted probably in our lifetimes in Washington.
And from his youngest days in North Dakota, Martin Sabo really strikes one as somebody who was always concerned with the underdog, always concerned with people who didn't have enough, whether it was good enough job, good enough education, health care. And so when he gets to Washington in this new role, he positions himself strategically, gets a seat on the Appropriations Committee, as you mentioned. And it strikes me, having been a former congressional staffer, when a freshman member is elected, you normally don't end up on a committee assignment like that.
No, it was a plum.
The breadth of his experience here in Minnesota through years of skill honed at the Minnesota Legislature helped him to achieve that, didn't it?
He had been a legislator for 18 years, he had been the Speaker of the Minnesota House for 6 years, and he had been the president of the National Conference of State Legislatures. Of course, he deserved a good committee assignment in the U.S. House.
And of course, we should mention, in case people aren't aware of this, many members of Congress, they cut their political teeth serving in state legislatures, so Martin probably knew a good many of them from his time at the NCSL.
Well, I suspect so, and I suspect he arrived with a positive reputation that he was able to leverage. Maybe the other, but relationship building is a big part of what Martin believed was his work. It mattered to him that he was able to relocate his family to the Washington suburbs to live there. That was an important step that we right now don't see many members of Congress take. It mattered to him that he worked on baseball games and other kinds of activities to build relationships. All of that he saw as part of his job to achieve the majorities. He wanted bipartisan majorities to pass major legislation.
And how does Martin's career in elective office come to a conclusion?
In March of 2006, we were all, those of us in the Capitol Press Corps, we were all surprised to be summoned to a press conference, I believe it was on a Saturday morning, announcing that he had decided to retire. It was just a few weeks before precinct caucuses. It seemed a little late for him to make such an announcement. I think he did it, as I recall, with a tear in his eye, but he had decided it was time to go home.
And when he stepped down from his seat, subsequently, Keith Ellison, now the Attorney General of Minnesota, won the DFL endorsement, defeated Martin's Chief of Staff, Mike Erlandson, for the endorsement.
Triggered quite a lively primary and an even livelier endorsement contest, as I recall. There was I remember on the Almanac program, they had some kind of a standing grid thing with all these candidates trying to garner attention, and it was a clever approach to remind people how much talent there was vying for this plum seat. These congressional seats are really plum opportunities in the
and they don't come along that often.
They don't come along, and so those who grab them usually hang on to them for dear life. It's interesting, we can, as an aside, note that Keith Ellison then did surprise us too by leaving voluntarily and choosing to run for Attorney General, which is where he is now.
Lori, I'm curious, your research on Martin Sabo, two questions for you as we come down to about our last 2 minutes here. In your research, what was the most surprising thing that you discovered about Martin Sabo that you didn't know? And finally, what would Martin Sabo, if he were here today, sadly he passed away in 2016, was it? What would he say today about the state of American politics?
Oh, I was surprised, I guess, by the strong influence of the Lutheran Free Church. How the values, the ideas about individual responsibility for this, you build up yourself for the service of the community, how deeply ingrained that was in him. And I think that's of real interest and note to me. But what would he say now? He would be dismayed right now. He would, I think, be speaking out right now. And he would be talking about the need to reassert the independence, the authority of the legislative branch of government. He was a master of the legislative branches of our government, both at the state and the federal level. And it took very much to heart that power of the purse that is vested by our state and federal constitution in that branch of government. The supine way in which the legislative branch in Washington has sort of yielded to the whims of the executive branch right now, it would bother him.
Martin believed fiercely in the idea of congressional oversight.
Absolutely.
That Congress, one of its key jobs is making sure that agencies are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
No, absolutely. And so that he would be calling on his fellow members of Congress and his fellow legislators at the state level to do their jobs as fulsomely as possible. That's what.
Lori, it's a great book. For our viewers who may be interested in finding this book, they can go on Amazon.
It's Minnesota Historical Society Press.
Minnesota Historical
and so
Society.
It should be, yes, on Amazon. It should be in a bookstore near you, and I hope that you'll look for it.
And again, it's titled Martin Sabo, The Making of the Modern Legislature, by our guest today, Lori Sturdevant. I don't know that we'll see the likes of a Martin Sabo again in our lifetimes, a remarkable person who made so many contributions to Minnesota's political history. Lori, thank you for being our guest today on Access to Democracy, and come back again soon.
Thank you, Steve.